Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New York State Museum. My name is Heidi Hill. I'm the Historic Site Manager at Cralo and Schuyler Mansion State Historic Sites. And those both they're both related directly to the 250th commemoration of the Revolutionary War. We're about a year into this commemoration, and there has been a wonderful sense of collaboration, and many strong partnerships have been formed in order to share this history of the birth of our nation. It's been a lot of fun for all of us at historic sites to see this really great sense of collaboration. Today's a good example of that, and I thank Jennifer Saunders, the director of the New York State Museum, and her wonderful staff, who we've worked with for many years, to help us reach a broader audience and accommodate more people than any historic house can do, right? We're very happy to be here, and I thank you all. Thanks to Catherine Weller and Kat Morehouse, who are always happy to support our programming. And Daniel Stinstra and also Conrad Brown-Lorcher, who always seem to be here to help with the technical support, and we love that. We're very grateful. In a moment, you'll hear from the speakers. They will be presenting Revolutionary Women, Lady Johnson, Angelica Schuyler, and the Politics of Liberty. They will share their research and their interpretations of the evidence they've worked with. The presenters and the moderator have all worked at Schuyler Mansion at one time or another, some currently, of course, and it's really been my privilege to watch and guide a little the flurry of excited activity that takes place around research at the site. The staff are just really into this, and it's just fun, really fun to watch, witness. And what's really fun is that the conversations and collaborations around ideas and possible interpretations hasn't stopped just because these staff members have moved on for promotions. Many people probably think that doing history is a solitary endeavor, during which a historian and individual determines the best interpretation of the scant extant evidence of the past. I would argue that more and better discoveries in historical research and thought are arrived at through more of a collegial team effort, sometimes at the same historic site or museum, but often through cross-pollination and from different research angles. That's how we do it at Schuyler Mansion, by working with colleagues at remote archives, sometimes Union College. Thank you, Megan. The National Park Service, other state agencies, other historic sites and museums, with college professors and researchers. It makes piecing this sort of very holy puzzle, there aren't a lot of pieces, back together much easier, and it generates a lot more ideas, perspectives, and insight. So allow me to introduce Danielle Funicello on the end there, who is presently the Interpretive Programs Assistant, or in plain speak, the Education Director at Fort Ontario State Historic Site. She left us to pursue her PhD work in American history with a focus on Angelica Schuyler Church. And Ian Mumpton on this end, the Interpretive Programs Assistant or Education Director at Johnson Hall State Historic Site. Ian worked at the mansion for many years, where he conducted thoughtful research and delivered really masterful interpretations for our audiences. Kayla Whitehouse is in the middle. She's our Historic Site Assistant. And she continues so much of that research. We also have two other staff members here, Sarah Lindecki and Maria Karasavitas. They're all doing fabulous research. But getting back to Kayla, she can pull historical facts out of a hat faster than you could even mouth the question. She will be our moderator this afternoon, and we're hoping to leave ample time for questions at the end. All three of these terrific employees, as well as others in the audience, have written a number of historical articles for the Schuyler Mansion blog, which I invite you all to explore. There are just, I don't know, many, many, many. How many would you say? You have to keep saying load more, load more, load more. There are just so many blog articles. So do take a look at those. And I believe Ian Mumpton will start us off today. Do not choose to meddle with her.
Thanks, Heidi, and thank you to the State Museum. Thank you, Danielle and Kayla, for coming on out and making this possible. When Heidi and Kayla reached out about collaborating on this project, that was really exciting because this was actually something that started a number of years ago with Danielle and I doing research at Schuyler Mansion. She was doing a lot of research into Angelica at the time. I was doing a lot of looking into loyalists and military intelligence at the time. And at pretty much the same moment, we both ran across a letter that we said, oh, the other one needs to see this. Went running down the hall, and it turned out to be the same letter. So I think that'll come up a little bit later. But it's been really neat to be able to revisit this topic and look at what we've learned since then to continue it. So Lady Johnson is one of my favorite historical figures from this time period for a number of reasons, and she has a fascinating story. It is a long story, and since we only have so much time today, we're going to be focusing on a very narrow slice of that overall story, specifically related to her life and her experiences in 1776, 1777, really a span of captivity and a significant challenge for her. But in order to tell that story, we need to really have a sense of who she was. So Lady Johnson, also known as Mary Watts, or often in the family referred to as Polly Watts, was born in 1753 into a family whose connections I cannot overemphasize enough. The Watts family were centered down in New York City, and they pretty much knew everybody. Her father not only was a judge and a major businessman, heavily involved in colonial politics at the time, but in New York at this time, the political landscape is really pretty much dominated by the Delancey faction and the Livingston faction. This is going to be a major factor for her. She really does grow up knowing absolutely everybody and encouraged to develop these sorts of connections. This is part of what is expected of her as a young woman from a prominent family with political connections, with financial connections. And of course, as in every age, those are two sides of the same coin. She is not only related to the Delanceys and Livingstons, but through that means that she's related to pretty much everybody else. Schuylers, Van Rensselaers, Tenbrooks, all of these major families, pretty much the Johnsons. Sir William Johnson's family is one of the main families that she is not as closely related to yet. We'll get there through the story. And growing up in this situation, she has access to good education. She's described from a very young age as being not only well educated, but people specifically remarking on her as a writer, her penmanship, but also her grasp of written communication, both in how she expresses herself and her reading ability. She is very insightful, picking up on critical details in just about everything she's reading through correspondence and through her education. This will be a skill set that is going to be particularly important for her. Now, she is often described specifically in terms of being connected to these New York families. She grows up in New York. A lot of early descriptions focus on those New York connections, but it's important to note that she is not strictly somebody with New York connections. She has these familial connections and then also travel connections throughout the rest of the colony, including up here towards Albany, specifically during the 1766. Oh, sorry, I hit one button too far there. 1766 span, she ends up traveling up here to Albany and actually out to Schuyler Flats, where she stays with a relative, her Aunt Margareta or Margaretta. And Anne Grant describes this visit, saying, I found Aunt Margaretta's house much enlivened by a very agreeable visitor. This was Miss Watts. She possessed much beauty and understanding and vivacity. Her playful humor exhilarated the whole household. I regarded her with admiration and delight, and her faithful excursions afforded great amusement to Aunt, and were like a gleam of sunshine amidst the gloom. Now, this is in this build-up to conflict, in the build-up to the revolution, conflict over taxation, so that, that gloom and contention that she's referring to. Polly is not oblivious to these goings on. She is engaging in conversation. She's very aware of this stuff, but she is still building these connections, making these sorts of impressions on people throughout this whole span. That spring, she actually travels out to German Flats, so she's getting familiar with territory along the Mohawk. And a lot of the terms that she's described by, here in this description from Anne Grant, possessing much understanding and vivacity, making these excursions, these are all aspects that we'll see reiterated throughout her life later on, and especially during the span of her captivity and imprisonment during the Revolution itself. 1773, she affirms those connections to one of the last remaining, powerful families, power player families in colonial New York that she was not yet as closely related to, wedding Sir John Johnson. The Johnsons, for any folks who are not familiar with them, are a very powerful family out along the Mohawk, is where their seat of power resides, but their influence is felt all across New York in military matters, in land matters, in mercantile matters, but specifically, most famously, in terms of native affairs. Sir William Johnson is, in a variety of capacities over his time in North America, taking this leading role in developing a relationship between the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee and other native groups as well, and really solidifying that relationship with Britain. His son, Sir John, is his oldest son by his first wife, Catherine Weisenberg, and is set to inherit a lot of that power, though not necessarily all of the diplomatic authority and position right out of the gate. But definitely, this joining between the Watts and the Johnson family is considered a very good move, and something that the Johnsons and their circle had been eyeing for several years before. Polly is actually mentioned by name by some of Sir William's friends, writing to him saying, hey, send John down to New York City, make sure he meets Polly Watts. She's brilliant, she's gorgeous, and she's loaded. This is somebody you want to have him know. And she's actually described very much that way by one of the family friends in 1773 in preparation for that union, when John Blackburn says, the lady is a fine genteel girl, much esteemed as well on account of the goodness of her temper as of her uncommon abilities, and she is ready to follow him anywhere. Again, these three aspects. She is, she's considered somebody who is very personable and well-connected. She is considered extremely intelligent and insightful, and she is somebody who takes charge and takes direction in life. She is a very active person in her personality and in her actions. That picture was supposed to pop up earlier, but this is actually an image from of New York City at the time with the raising of one of the Liberty poles relating to early revolutionary protests, and in the span when she makes her way up to stay at Schuyler Flats there with her Aunt Margareta. So shortly after her wedding to Sir John, though, while this is a great match, things start to shift in New York very dramatically. The revolution has been a slow buildup, but in 1774, in July, Sir William Johnson dies. This changes everything. Within a very short span, revolutionary activity in the Mohawk Valley in particular expands in a massive way, more and more committees being formed, more and more direct action being taken. Polly and Sir John move from Fort Johnson at this point up to Johnson Hall, the other family residence built in 1763. And about a year later, they're living there through this span, but about a year later, the family starts to have to make some major changes. Revolutionary violence in New York surges. Loyalists in particular, including especially poor folks, working class folks, tenant farmers and the like, who have less protection, are facing major amounts of violence and persecution, and it's building towards significantly more. But even families with a lot of power and stability and protection are facing a lot of these dangers as well. Her father, John Watts, is actually ordered by the government to flee New York. It is considered no longer safe for him. And his wife, Anne, Polly's mother, is unable to accompany him at that time due to her health and has to remain behind. This is going to be very important when we come back to it in a moment regarding Polly Johnson's situation. Just a month later, under threat of violence, the destruction of the home, possible arrest and imprisonment in Albany, other Johnson families start to escape the area. This includes Guy Johnson and Polly's sister-in-law, also named Polly, and Daniel Klaus and his wife Anne. So these are sons-in-law and daughters of Sir William Johnson. So Polly's in-laws having to flee out to Oswego at this point. Now, Polly and her sister-in-law, Polly, are both pregnant at this time. So they're looking at all of this happening while dealing with, the possibilities of complications there, major change in life. They begin refortifying Johnson Hall. They actually rebuild stockades and palisades around the hall at this time. It is being defended with artillery, swivel guns, wall guns, blunderbusses, and a large number of heavily armed tenants. Johnson Hall is basically a fort in this span. Shortly after that, however, they get news that, the conflict expands in Johnstown. Sheriff White, Royal Sheriff for Tryon County, attempts to arrest a rebel figure in the community, and this actually leads to open fighting, open conflict. Several hundred people gathering to attempt to capture Sheriff White in turn, potentially for imprisonment or execution. Part of their concern too is that he has been promising to free people enslaved by rebels and basically form a black loyalist force in the Mohawk Valley, which is not particularly popular with the rebel government in Albany at that time. And this is the same span, while this fighting is happening in her community, that Polly finds out that her mother has passed, separated from her husband by the conflict. She is unable to go and dies from her illness down in New York City. Within days, she also learns that Mary, or Polly Johnson, her sister-in-law, has died in childbirth at Oswego 1 year to the day after Sir William's death. So 2 of these women in her life, very close to her. One, unable to go, unable to flee the violence, dies. The other, who makes that attempt, who's in that situation, also passes. If she's in this scenario, what is she going to do? This is the same span when her husband writes to his sister Anne, saying that if anything should happen against us, it will not be safe. The rebels are very much enraged and stop at no abuse. This is not an overstatement at this point. So the following year, we get right out of the gate a raid on Johnstown. Rebel government in Albany, it's Schuyler's command. They send a force of approximately 3,000 to disarm the fortifications at Johnson Hall and to arrest and imprison loyalists in the area. Schuyler says that any opposition to this will be met with force without distinction, which is pretty hefty language to be using in what's supposedly a peacekeeping operation. We actually recreated this at Johnson Hall this past January. And big thank you again to Kayla and Schuyler staff for assisting with research on that, sending out a lot of Schuyler side of that correspondence. Just 5 months later, While Sir John was paroled in January, Colonel Dayton and the 3rd New Jersey are ordered by Philip Schuyler to Johnstown to arrest Sir John, as well as remaining Scottish tenants and a number of other suspected loyalists. In total, they arrest well over 50 people during this span. Shortly after that raid, there's 57 being sent to prison camps in one go, with more being brought in regularly throughout that. Schuyler deems and writes this to Sir John, saying, "It's therefore necessary for the safety of the inhabitants and weal of the country that I have ordered you a close prisoner and sent down to Albany." John does not stick around. He escapes to Canada with a strong force of Scottish tenants, native allies, and other loyalist forces. However, while the hall is confiscated, Polly is not really necessarily in a position to go, but it's also not necessarily safe for her to stay. She's facing an important choice here. One of the big factors in remaining is that at this time she has 2 children under the age of 2, and another one who will be arriving shortly. So she's now in very much the same situation that her sister-in-law had been in the summer before. Of, does she remain as her mother did, or is she going to attempt to escape? And given that she has these children and that she is pregnant, that really puts her in a situation of not being able to risk flight through the forests and rivers to reach Canada at this time. So she has to follow another option, and that is to resist. So when Lady Johnson is ordered to surrender the keys to the house, to pack only her apparel, and to be sent out to Albany, she needs to start trying to assert some control over this. Things are moving very quickly. She had been told she could remain, but now she's finding out she's going to be sent out to Albany to an uncertain situation. What can she do to try and control the situation? First is to take advantage of the discomfort of the officers sent to arrest her. She is a young mother of high status, technically the second cousin of their commanding officer, and a civilian that they are being ordered to arrest. There's a lot of unclear ground here relating to her gender and social status, and not everyone involved is completely comfortable with it. For instance, Captain Bloomfield, who is doing a lot of these interactions with her, says specifically that when she burst into a flood of tears, it affected him so much that he thought it proper to leave her alone. Retreating from the room, giving her time to compose herself. This is expected of him as an officer, and a polite young gentleman. However, it has been noted that the amount of time that she is left, there are references to a number of missing documents and such in the hall after this span that has been speculated this is actually an opportunity for her to hide those as well, unbeknownst to Bloomfield, hide or destroy those. Next step in resistance, delude. Plant false information. She is determined to give her husband as much of a head start as possible, and so she reports that she has received letters from him from supply caches that she has sent out, leading him out to Oswego, that he is going due west, out towards Oswego, when it turns out he is actually, as she and other people in the community know, traveling north first, up past the Sacandaga, burning the fish house, and then making his way to northern stretch in Canada, instead of making a route directly due west. This information splits revolutionary forces that are in pursuit and partially contributes to giving him time to be able to escape. Now she needs to be able to delay the situation herself, because while she is home, she is surrounded by allies, and the longer she's there, the safer she and her children are. So she asks Colonel Dayton for permission to remain. Again, these officers don't have clear orders going into this about what to do with her. Schuyler had been waffling about whether to let her stay or to leave. Dayton has ordered her to go. She asks for that to be reconsidered, and he has to take time now to consult with his commanding officer. Buys more time. Next, she takes direction of the situation herself. When she is ultimately ordered a prisoner to Albany, she specifically asks that Bloomfield be the one to accompany her. Not only is he known to the family, but he has already been observed being uncomfortable, taking direct control over what she does. She has a lot more leeway working with this guy and room to be able to move. She also takes physical direction. She actually is the one to drive herself away from the hall in a phaeton. Bloomfield writes that Lady Johnson and Mrs. Mulligan in a phaeton, attended by 2 servants in livery and the overseer, her 2 children and the nurse in a wagon. When they arrive in Schenectady, he reports that she is allowed to dine, where she is visited by, quote, a pack of Tories who came to visit her ladyship. So while she is a prisoner, how much control do they really have over her? She's still dining where she wants, driving herself. She's really exercising a lot of authority and actively moving to take a lot of that agency in this scenario. Lastly, plausible deniability. 5 miles outside of Albany in the Pine Barrens, the convoy is attacked by loyalists who try to waylay them. There's almost a large fight here. Lady Johnson does not stop. She keeps going, but she does not try to escape. She continues driving straight on to Albany, so that in this scenario, if she is rescued, great. That works out very well for her. If she is not, there is nobody who can point at her and say, you tried to escape. She is being a completely cooperative prisoner in this scenario. Really the best path that she could take in that moment. So it leads to this question of who is in control of the situation, and no one really has a clear idea. So once she arrives in Albany, she is placed under house arrest just outside of town with relatives in Bethlehem, and begins to utilize her connections and her writing skills to effect her freedom. Immediately, she actually gets Bloomfield to request her to be allowed to be returned. He is told to turn her over to the Albany Committee, and he asks of them whether she can be returned out to Johnson Hall, as she asks. And their response is one of confusion. As to whether Lady Johnson may return and be permitted to stay at Johnson Hall, the question is absurd. Why was her ladyship brought to Albany? Nothing shall be done till the committee receives further directions from General Schuyler. Lady Johnson may be permitted to have the privilege of the city until further orders. The Albany Committee of Safety doesn't quite know what to make of this situation. The military's captured her, but now we're being told that she's our prisoner? She a civil or military prisoner? It's unclear. Schuyler says that he cannot permit Lady Johnson to return to Albany, that she is to leave Albany, but she is to remain there until he hears from General Washington. So he passes the buck again up the chain. Washington can deal with this situation, despite the fact that he's the one who has ordered her to Albany. But while he is saying that he has to get Washington's permission, he then writes to Washington to tell Washington not to give him permission to send her away. He intends to use her as a hostage. He feels that as long as she is in a place where she is not permitted to go to any place where she may escape, her detention may induce her husband to seek accommodation. He follows this up shortly afterwards by saying, well, it's not even me who really wants her as a hostage, but the people of Tryon County have requested this of me. So the general opinion of the people of Tryon County and here that whilst Lady Johnson is kept a kind of hostage, Sir John, who can by means of the Mohawks receive intelligence from her as often as she may please to send it, will not carry matters to excess, and I've been entreated to keep her here. So again, he's trying to keep a certain amount of distance, control of the situation, but not fully committing to it. Lady Johnson, however, takes control of the situation. She writes to Washington to tell him, Sir, I take the liberty of complaining to you. It is from you I expect redress. I am not allowed to return home, and my situation here made as disagreeable as it can be by the repeated threats and messages from General Schuyler, too indelicate and cruel to be expected from a gentleman. I would prefer my captivity under your excellency's protection to being in the power of General Schuyler, who rules with more severity than could be wished. Washington does not want to touch this situation. So he says that she may remain in Albany until further directions. And in this span, those cruel remarks and threats from General Washington do not seem to be hyperbole. Reports are reaching her brother-in-law Guy Johnson, her brother-in-law Daniel Klaus, her husband, other figures via communications that she and others are sending out of Albany, that not only is she being held hostage in general, but direct threats are being made that if British forces, whether John or General Burgoyne in 76, advance, that she will be delivered up to the enraged populace. Another that says she will not be saved from the violence of the people. Now, throughout all of this, Lady Johnson is trying to collect information. She's collecting intelligence, both on what's happening in Albany and on her own situation, and she's getting conflicting reports. And rather than, sitting back and trying to wade through this, she goes directly to the source of the obfuscation and confusion and tells Philip Schuyler, "I was much surprised to be informed that the committee were adverse to my returning home, as I did not look upon myself as being in their power. I was compelled to leave my house by your order, and by your order have been detained. Every proceeding in regard to me has been, sir, in your name, as I can prove. I can produce a letter from Mr. Livingston where he declares it is not in the power of the committee to detain or give me leave to return. I cannot help thinking it strange that I should be referred to them after being repeatedly informed my confinement was owing to you." Again, nobody knows quite how to handle this situation. They're really writing these rules, building the airplane as they fly it. And this is not a situation that any of these figures wants to remain in, so everybody takes turns trying to pass authority off until finally they come up with the idea of, well, what if we just send her home? Out to Tryon County again. However, Tryon County says, "Thank you, but no thank you. It appears she is no prisoner of us, and therefore we do not choose to meddle with her." So, after securing permission to finally travel down to Fishkill, send her away, make her somebody else's problem, she is granted permission to go to Fishkill to petition for permission to go to New York City, but ultimately that permission is denied. She has now utilized and tapped out every avenue of paperwork resistance, so she begins to effect a more immediate and direct action plan, choosing winter lodgings in Wallkill, about 70 miles outside of New York City. Long distance, but not insurmountable, especially in winter travel when the roads are frozen. At this time, all three of her children are with her. The third child has been born. She is also accompanied by her sister, a nurse, and enslaved servants. And in February of 1777, they actually begin their escape attempt. Sir John is in New York City, has sent a sleigh up to them. They have developed a network of other connections, people who are willing to support them in this. They've obtained changes of clothing. By her own description, "In despair of a release, your petitioner made a bold effort and effected escape in disguise." This is her description to His Royal Majesty. Actually, I believe that should be... I have to double check if she was when on the date on when she was writing that one. I may have actually mislabeled that one, bringing that over. But in her royal petition later in life, she describes escaping in disguise. They have several close calls. She's actually almost recognized by a former employee of her father, but it's been long enough since they have seen her, and she is not dressed as a gentlewoman. She is dressed in much plainer clothing. And given the societal expectations at the time, this helps her to avoid being recognized. And ultimately, they do reach British lines in New York City. So this is a very abbreviated version of this whole scenario that played out over a number of months in this span. But just from this sampling, we can see how Lady Johnson is working to take advantage of the uncertainty and social expectations placed on her in terms of, her gender, her social status, to kind of create space to be able to operate in, to avoid undue scrutiny, and to be able to simultaneously use what is expected of her to make changes to affect her own agency, but then also breaking with that in ways that people are not expecting. More or less, she is routinely underestimated throughout this entire span. She is seen as a side character to her husband. She is the hostage who control of her controls Sir John. Turns out, though, controlling her is much more difficult than folks had thought throughout this span. So when we recenter Lady Johnson in her own story, a number of things start to really emerge. We see her, as somebody who meets, exceeds, and breaks with those expectations, and to be able to advocate for herself and her family. We also see an effective handbook for resistance. When you're facing a military takeover of your government by a reactionary force of landlords and mercantile gentry, take advantage of that paranoia, take advantage of the disorganization, and take advantage of the inherent misogyny in the system to resist. We see a real person, not a character. We see somebody who experiences a lot. We see somebody who is both, in a very privileged scenario in certain regards, in an extremely vulnerable scenario in other regards. And in the words of Susan Farnham-Durn, who wrote an amazing thesis back in 1976 for the bicentennial year, 50 years ago, on Lady Johnson here, I couldn't think of a better way to conclude than as she did. Lady Mary Watts Johnson is worthy of study because she is a human being whose joys and sorrows were recorded, at least partially. There's a lot more to her story, a lot more to explore, and at other points, hopefully we'll be able to do so. But for now, I'll conclude and turn this over to Danielle with just one shameless plug. Coming up May 16th and 17th, we're going to be carrying her story forward with a recreation of the confiscation and occupation of Johnson Hall in Johnstown, recreating her arrest and departure from Johnson Hall. So if you want to learn more about her story, more about those experiences, come on out and we'll be talking more about it. So.
I'm going to jump right in because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions here. So again, my name is Danielle Funicello. I currently work at Fort Ontario, which I think we'll get into a little later. There are some connections to this story there too. But in the meantime, let's dive right into Angelica Schuyler and her loyalties. So I'm going to focus a lot on that letter we talked about that both Ian and I kind of found at the same time. Let's dive right into it. So on July 4th, 1776, Angelica Schuyler wrote her father, Major General Philip Schuyler, reporting a Tory assassination plot discovered 2 weeks prior, aimed at George Washington and other revolutionary leaders in New York City. In the same letter, she explained an interaction with Lady Mary Watts Johnson, a loyalist held prisoner by Philip Schuyler. Angelica begged her father's approval of her actions, saying, "If you approve of this, I shall applaud myself for it. If not, my future conduct must be improved by your example." This letter, written when Angelica was 20 years old, is the first known letter written in her hand, and it is, in my opinion, one of the best sources we have for understanding some of the roles and loyalties that Angelica and young revolutionary women like her took on during the American Revolution. We'll come back to the details of this letter in a moment, but I want to give you a little biographical context so that we can better understand her situation when she wrote this letter. Angelica was born Angelica Schuyler on February 20th, 1756, in a Dutch-style, gable-roofed house on the corner of State and Pearl Streets, owned by her grandmother, Cornelia van Cortlandt Schuyler. Philip, Cornelia's eldest son, lived in half of the State Street home with his young wife, Catherine van Rensselaer Schuyler, while Cornelia lived in and ran a mercantile business out of the other. Angelica's birth and baptism were recorded in the back of the family's Dutch language Bible, which is, I don't know if it is at the moment, but it's often on display at Schuyler Mansion. In Albany, the family's Dutchness was, if anything, an advantage, since half of the city still spoke Dutch as their primary language, despite formally and finally having become an English colony in 1674. But the Schuylers knew how and when to leverage their culture, and over the course of Angelica's childhood, they anglicized the parts of their lives necessary to keep up with fashions. Their names, their religious leanings, they attended both the Dutch Reform and the Anglican churches in Albany, and eventually their home. They began construction of their Albany home, now Schuyler Mansion, in 1761, and moved in when Angelica was 9 years old. By that time, Angelica had two sisters, born by then, Elizabeth and Margaret, and a brother on the way. Catherine had also lost a set of twins in 1761. She would, as you can see from the family tree here, she would go on to have 8 children that survived into adulthood, with Angelica and her youngest sibling Katie sharing a birthday 25 years apart. We can speculate about whether the Schuylers would have raised their girls differently if they had a surviving son earlier, but as it was, the Schuyler daughters received an excellent education and were encouraged to explore subjects that went beyond what male philosophers on female education recommended at the time. Though we don't have many records of her exact education, later letters show that Angelica took lifelong advantage of her education. She learned arithmetic, geography, French, Latin, and took interest in subjects as far-flung as finance and astronomy. From mentions of the children throughout Philip's letters, we know that he didn't hesitate to give his daughters access to his library either, which mostly contained legal texts and philosophy works. Nor did he hesitate to take the girls with him on political outings, including Haudenosaunee conferences in his role as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Also critical to the Schuylers' upbringing was the ability to create powerful social networks. Philip did not only view socializing as a nicety, but as a tool to maintaining the family's status and power. He once wrote to his youngest daughter, Katie, quote, "The trouble and fatigue attendant on the necessity of being in much company, although irksome, is a tax which we must pay to society." So now that we know a little about Angelica's upbringing, let's return to our letter here. When Continental Congress militarized in 1775 against Britain, Philip Schuyler's political leanings, military experience, and intelligence network made him an obvious choice to manage the Northern Department of the Continental Army. And he was appointed Major General. At the time this letter is written, which is about 6 weeks after Philip Schuyler's raid on Johnson Hall that Ian discussed, Philip had just left his Albany home en route to Crown Point. Angelica sends this letter on his heels that gives us a lot of unexpected information. It begins, "Time passes very heavily here." Americans now celebrate July 4th, 1776, which is the day of Angelica's letter, as a triumphant one, celebrating the Declaration of Independence, which had been approved by the Second Continental Congress just 2 days prior on July 2nd. Angelica, however, describes an oppressive atmosphere. In the summer of 1776, Albany citizens were dejected and impatient to hear from the front lines. New York City was controlled by loyalists. The Revolutionary Army had suffered considerable losses in Canada, and halfway in between, Angelica waited at home with her mother, Elizabeth, Peggy, and 4 younger siblings. She went about her daily life, aiding her mother in the management of their family home, caring for younger siblings, and socializing with both civilian and military peers, with an eye for extending her personal networks. But she also watched and listened for information that might help the revolution's dire situation. This is something she would have been well prepared for, since Philip ran one of the largest and most complex intelligence networks of the time. As Ian alluded to with Philip's failure to recognize Lady Johnson's ability to gather and spread information, women were actually in an ideal position during the 18th century to gather intelligence, simply because many men held the base assumption that these women were docile, apolitical, and uninvolved, despite having a war in their home country. And also because women were still considered integral to the war efforts on both sides in terms of the social coherence and the vital labor that they provided. Obviously, this is a huge oversight for someone like Philip Schuyler to assume that other women, like Lady Johnson, would not engage in political and military affairs, while at the same time expecting that of the female members of his family. And engage Angelica did. In her letter, she tells Philip, "The idea of a ministerial fleet is lost in our disgust of American perfidy. Mr. Matthews is condemned, and Wallace, Jones, and Beach are confined. The fleet were to have attacked the city on the day in which the conspirators were to have assassinated our worthy generals." And I apologize, the font changed on me, so that doesn't all line up in the box there. In mid-June, George Washington and other military leaders had discovered a loyalist plot targeting them. Historians disagree on whether that plot included an assassination attempt, as Angelica and others suggested in their letters at the time, but they agree that it included plans to sabotage Washington's armies at the same time that the British Navy launched an attack on New York, just as Angelica reports here. The plot involved more than 30 arrests, and the progress of the investigation was documented in a document called Minutes of a Conspiracy Against the Liberties of America, which had been written by a secret council convened to arrest, interrogate, and deal out punishment to anyone involved in the plot. With the council's investigation still ongoing, none of the information later published in the minutes was available to the public. And although rumors circulated in New York City, including in newspapers, about what had happened and who was involved, most amounted to hearsay, and very few published accounts align with what we find in those minutes that were published again in the 19th century, much later. The names Angelica cites, however, all have pretty likely matches in those minutes. They most likely refer to Judge Thomas Jones, who we do believe Philip Schuyler would have had some previous dealings with. There's also a Hugh Wallace, who Philip Schuyler probably worked with at some point when he served in the New York General Assembly. And finally, the beach there is probably a misspelling of Theophylact, quite the name, Bach, who was a known associate of Wallace's. With the exception of David Matthews, also mentioned here, who was the mayor of New York City, and therefore a very notable arrest, most of these names were not things that Angelica could have found from a publicly available source like a newspaper. Some of these arrests were made in New York City less than a week before Angelica reports on them in Albany. And with the travel time, that means she's getting this information pretty quickly. All this to say, Angelica was, at the very least, tapped into a prompt and well-informed rumor mill, if not an intentional intelligence network. And lest you argue that perhaps Angelica was just passing on information that had been sent to the house for Philip, I confirmed that Richard Varick, who is Philip's military secretary, was stationed at the home throughout Philip's Crown Point trip, and he would have been the appropriate recipient of any and all of Philip's letters in his absence. So it's almost certain that Angelica was sent this information directly by someone she knew in New York City who knew that she would want the information. What's more is made clear from her letter is that Angelica viewed this plot as American faithlessness and disloyalty. That's our definition of perfidy that she uses there. Loyalists were, to her, colonists who had turned against their own interests and betrayed their fellow continentals by allying with the British. This makes the next piece of information that she shares all the more interesting in terms of societal loyalties. She says, there was a report in town that Sir John Johnson was dead. Some person had told Lady Johnson and made her very unhappy. I desired a lady to tell her that he was not dead, but not to mention my name. Despite the fact that Mary Watts Johnson was a political prisoner and a loyalist, which Angelica has just told us she finds repugnant, her loyalties and sympathies are complicated by social expectations. Angelica Schuyler and Mary Watts Johnson are of a similar social standing. Their families are intertwined economically, politically, and socially going back generations. And in fact, Angelica and Mary share two great-great-grandparents. That is both Colonel Philip Peter C. Schuyler and Jeremias Van Rensselaer, making them third cousins twice over. Their shared status and history came with behavioral expectations, and those expectations did not disappear with the divisions created by the American Revolution. Angelica, therefore, feels that it is her duty of a woman of social standing not to let Lady Johnson suffer due to an inaccurate report. But she's also aware that Lady Johnson is her father's political prisoner, and in light of that, doesn't want the Schuyler name attached to her correction. She follows this with the appeal to her father that I mentioned previously. If you approve of this, I shall applaud myself for it. If not, my future conduct must be improved by your example. When talking about this letter, Ian and I thought that it was telling that Angelica does not say, if you don't approve, I won't interfere in the future. And she also asks for forgiveness, not permission to take action. To me, this indicates that Angelica is fairly confident her father will approve of how she's handled this situation. This letter and the stories attached to it are only a brief snapshot of Angelica's life. But from From the life that unfurls after this, I can tell you that the confidence with which she participates in what we call the public sphere, once believed to only be the purview of men in the 18th century, only progresses throughout her life. And I think many people may be surprised to learn that Angelica Schuyler, Mary Watts Johnson, and other women like them, who are very vocal about these issues, face very little pushback for intrusions like the one that Angelica is making into the political, economic, intellectual, and even military matters during the time. And yet we tend to remember these women as outspoken, as outliers, and even perhaps as deviants. But I would like to offer an alternate narrative. This is a quote that I think about a lot from historian Joan Kelly. She writes, "Events that further the historical development of men, liberating them from their natural, social, or ideological constraints, have quite different, even opposite effects on women." This was certainly true during the American Revolution. It results in sort of a liberation of constraints for white men in America and a subsequent restriction on the freedoms of women in the form of the cult of domesticity in the early 19th century. However, I also think that during Angelica's lifetime from 1756 to 1814, we see an inverse of this quote as well. The upheaval of the revolution, the war itself and its immediate aftermath, represents a temporary breakdown of social and ideological systems for men. This lack of structure lent women, especially those of the wealthy, educated elite, a loosening of the constraints which bound them to the private and interior spheres. For Angelica Schuyler, Mary Watts Johnson, Abigail Adams, and many women like them, this was a chance to renegotiate women's status and power in relation to men in the same way that revolutionary men were trying to renegotiate their status and power relative to the government. Angelica's correspondence with her father, Alexander Hamilton, her husband, John Barker Church, and, that's weird. Oh, we're going in the wrong direction, that's why. Here we go. And many of the other men shown here who are parts of her later social network, except Thomas Jefferson, who writes her things like, "The tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsion." I would like to point out, though, that in the same letter, he tells her about the Constitution that's just been passed. So he talks to her about politics, but is also like, this isn't for you, though. Anyway, all of these, or many of these men and her interactions with us tell us that Angelica's social peers agreed that the public sphere was an appropriate place for women. So why do we view these women as outliers? I think the answer to this question lies in when, how, and who by early American history was documented. And in this case, I'm going to throw Angelica's sister Elizabeth under the bus a little here as an example. If you're a fan of the Hamilton musical, you may already know that Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton played a huge role in collecting many of her family's papers and preserving her husband's legacy, and that in the process, she destroyed many of her own papers. Less known, however, is the fact that during her 97-year life, Elizabeth and her son, John Church Hamilton, also heavily edited and carefully curated her family's papers, often removing anything that would paint the family in an unattractive light. So here's one of her letters from the Library of Congress, one of Hamilton's letters from the Library of Congress, and either John Church Hamilton or Elizabeth has scribbled that out, and that ink is dated from a much later date, probably sometime in the mid-19th century. And the challenge with this is that by the time Elizabeth is deciding what to keep and what to redact, a woman's place had very firmly returned to the domestic sphere. So in the early to mid-19th century, a patriotic woman was now considered one who was virtuous, motherly, and cared only that her male children, in particular, became good citizens of their new nation. There's very little room for intellectual women who crafted their own power and influence and who had a say in the politics of their time. It's in this context, that many women took their place, or didn't, in revolutionary history. Elizabeth, it seems, chose to redact herself almost entirely from her husband's papers, and she may have done the same for other female family members in the papers that she had control of. In contrast, I showed Abigail Adams earlier because she's a great example. John Adams outlived Abigail, and blatantly refused to destroy his wife's papers, despite the fact that during her lifetime, she repeatedly said, when I'm gone, destroy my papers. So what I leave you with today is that when we consider a woman like Angelica Schuyler Church or Mary Watts Johnson, who had clear loyalties and backed them up with their actions during the American Revolution, what makes them exceptional is not that they took action in a war, which clearly affected them deeply, but that exceptional documentation remains to tell these stories. So thank you.
Are these on? Yeah.
I got it. They're on, but I can't access them.
All right, so I know we are running short on time for what our scheduled time was, but we'd like to get some discussion and then ask some questions from the audience if we have some time for that. But so my first question is, we all of us here, and Heidi, and we have a couple other coworkers here, we work at New York State Historic Sites, which are managed by the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And our agency does have an initiative called the Our Whole History Initiative, which it seeks to reveal and share historically undertold stories of ordinary and extraordinary people across New York State. So, tying to what Danielle was just saying, we have the stories of these two ladies specifically because they were recorded. And part of that is a result of their own privilege, and that, further privileges us to know their histories and their letters and things like that. But even just in this one interaction between Lady Johnson and Angelica, we do have more of these, these undertold stories. So quoting that letter that Angelica wrote to Philip Schuyler, she said, "I desired a lady to tell Lady Johnson that Sir Johnson wasn't dead." Do we have any idea of who this lady was and what other people might be involved in this story who aren't recorded?
Yeah, I think in that letter particularly, we have at least two people whose stories we don't know. And that unfortunately, we don't have a tie-in for who that lady is she asks. My inclination, because they call her a lady and because it's capitalized, I would say it's probably someone of a not too far from their own social class. And that Angelica's just sort of using them as a buffer. So kind of saying this is another lady who it would be appropriate to go, who it would be appropriate for that lady to reach out to Lady Johnson and make this announcement. So I would guess it's probably not, for instance, an enslaved person, but we don't know that for sure. The other person that's notably missing from that letter is who sent Angelica the information. We don't know the gender of that person. We don't know how active they are. I think when we had first sort of discovered this story, both me and Ian's pet theory was Kitty Livingston, who is a very close friend of all the Schuyler girls. And she, I believe, was living in New York City. Probably escaped soon after, if not already, but was a similar age to Angelica. But that's really just kind of a fun theory. But it's worth pointing out, though, a lot of Angelica's education did happen in New York City. So she would have also had the opportunity to make both male and female friends who would have been aware of her political leanings and her interests and might have been tipped off to the fact that would be something that would be information she was interested in receiving.
And as far as other people in these stories, continuing with the theme of women in these stories that either weren't explored, their stories aren't explored within the sources that we have identified or have survived, or just that, within the confines of time. We know that there's a nurse with Lady Johnson, who is going to be, she is being impacted and affected by Lady Johnson's captivity. Lady Johnson is being held prisoner to try to control her husband, but the nurse, enslaved servants who Lady Johnson brings with her, they're also in this situation. Lady Johnson is trying to resist this captivity while at the same time bringing people who she herself holds in captivity with her in that scenario. So there's a lot of these other stories. She may be the center of her own story. She centralizing her as that figure sheds amazing light, tells an amazing story. There's these other stories too. I mean, Clarissa Putman, folks may be familiar with her. She's Sir John Johnson's first wife. Not legally, but under common law, joined together, they have children. Shortly before he marries Polly Johnson, he sends her and the children out of the house and has limited to no contact with them for a number of years. Later on, though, is reconnecting with the children, and that causes friction between him and Polly when she starts saying that he's spending all of her money on, some of these other connections, including his earlier children. So I tend to look at these exemplary, not, as Danielle was saying, exemplary, not unique stories as an invitation to keep looking for more. There's always going to be more stories out there, and that's the fun part of all this, more to explore.
Yeah, and I think to kind of add to some of the folks that you were pointing out in that, I think in the question you sort of pointed out that it's sort of a privilege, and because of their privilege that we know about these women, and that often the women whose narratives run adjacent to these, but whose stories we don't know, they're often in much more vulnerable positions. So like the nurse, she's really reliant on She's reliant on Lady Johnson to make it through this, because that's the only way she's going to make it through this. She's in the same situation, but she doesn't have that social buffer that Lady Johnson has in terms of how she's going to be treated by the soldiers, by Philip Schuyler, by other people in that situation. Because even though she may or may not have done anything politically against them, by association, she is guilty and she is a prisoner and she is part of this.
So my next question is talking about the people that they had surrounding them. So that does also tie into, this. So as you said, Lady Johnson married Sir Johnson in 1973. But very shortly after that was when hostilities really started ramping up. She moved from New York City to out eventually towards Johnson Hall. And, at the start of the war, her father left to England. She lost both her mother and her sister-in-law. Many of their other friends left or had to flee because of the war. Alternatively, Angelica, at this time, she was up to 6 siblings. So still had a couple on the way, but she had 6 siblings by this time. She lived at home with her family. There was a number of other relatives in the area in Albany, as she lived still where she grew up. She had all of her friends, all of their family connections. How do you think these two different, Angelica had this huge support network, and Lady Johnson was pretty much on her own once Sir John had been, he had fled. How do you think that, that affected their actions in a situation like this?
I think it creates a situation where, Lady Johnson is not alone in that she has these connections built up, but she has to fight against people who have a direct invested goal in preventing her from making these connections. Her brother is in Albany. He's petitioning on her behalf. She can communicate with him. She has native contacts that she can send communications through, but she has to be doing that clandestinely, because doing that openly not only puts a target on her back and restricts those lines of communication for her, it puts other people in her network at risk, potentially identifying those communication routes. Danielle can probably speak more to Angelica's side in that, but I guess I would just wonder what sort of dangers are there or obstacles are there for Angelica in doing that? We were talking about her dad is overall very supportive of her engagement in a lot of that sort of stuff. What were there risks, would you say, for her in trying to pursue or engage in that stuff, even with her father being generally supportive?
I kind of think at this point, there's not a lot. What's really interesting to me is that Angelica, about a year later, some of you may be familiar with the fact that she elopes. She elopes with a man by the name of John Barker Church, who is an Englishman, but he's an Englishman working for the Continental Congress. And what's interesting to me about that is she kind of almost deliberately separates herself from that support network. That she's got this really sort of safe situation in play, but I think she wanted independence from her family and wanted the ability to explore and build her own connections. And she very much does that. And John Barker Church really allows her to. He is he becomes a contractor where he's selling supplies to mainly the French army that gets involved. But because of that, he is traveling with the military encampments, and she becomes very much like an officer's wife, involved in all of those social operations and things like that. And I think it's really interesting that I think perhaps because she's so sheltered and she is so protected up to this point, she kind of didn't see that as a dangerous or scary thing. She saw that as being able to build her own connections and build on the family connections that she had. That makes sense.
And I guess, do you think that Lady Johnson was purposely trying to take charge of her own situation so that she didn't get the few remaining contacts she had into any further trouble?
It's hard to say. There are some avenues of her communications that are very publicly identified. Like everybody knows that she is communicating through her brother. Schuyler and Washington talk about that, whether there are several gentlemen that they would be willing to take as security for her good behavior, basically a hostage exchange sort of situation so that they could retrieve her if they needed. And that's very much in the public eye. These guys are all talking about that. Schuyler makes reference to the fact that through Mohawk couriers and whatnot, she can communicate with John, but he doesn't seem to have the sort of specific information there. So we're seeing multiple levels of that. And as far as the clandestine aspects of it, she's very good at that. We don't know exactly who those couriers are. We know that there was a large loyalist resistance in Albany. We tend to think of loyalists as people who are absolutely rah-rah-ree behind the king and crown and British government. But really, if we expand that definition to be counter-revolutionaries, people who did not trust the government in Albany, who is run by people that a lot of working class and vulnerable groups in the Hudson and Mohawk valleys have had issues with for generations by this point. Suddenly they come and say, we're going to have a war. It's going to be great. When it's all done, you'll get to vote if you own land, and we own 90% of the land. Who's on board? There's a lot of people who say, hold on, I'm not necessarily up for this. But whether or not they support the crown, whether or not they're active loyalists, if you resist the revolution, you are considered an enemy of the people, an enemy of the state. That vehement language that Angelica uses, American perfidy, but they are actually declared enemies of the state. So that leaves a lot of people in this community who are very open to the idea of resistance, whether or not they wanted to see stronger British rule. There are a lot of enslaved people in Albany who are resisting at this point. There are a lot of tenant farmers who are resisting, whether or not these individuals can leave or not. Those who can do, those who can't support each other internally. Later in the conflict, the committees in Albany learned that a woman named Mary Butler is operating an intelligence gathering service directly under their nose, running a tavern where she gets soldiers drunk, takes their equipment, gives it to loyalists and to people attempting to flee enslavement, and sends them on out the door. She is caught. She is drummed out of town, but this network exists. To what degree Mary Johnson is actively tapping into it or not, she's not selling out her contacts. We still don't know who exactly ran some of that information to her, and good for her. It's also job security for getting to try to find it down the line.
Yeah, so I think we wanted to open it up if there was any questions from anyone in the audience. We do have another microphone up there.
Oh, I see a question. Yeah, you said that they were both well educated. Did they have tutors, or was there school at that time that ladies could attend?
A combination, it seems, at least for the Schuylers. There are boarding schools, and we do have Schuyler Mansion has records of receipts where Philip Schuyler is paying, interestingly, not usually in cash, but like, for instance, if they were boarding over the winter, the payment was in wood to be used for the fireplace. So in other words, they're paying the business's expenses for them. So we do know that the girls attend boarding schools in New York for parts of their education. Other parts of their education are probably happening within the home. We know, for instance, that while at the Schuyler house in Albany, the Schuyler Mansion in Albany, Philip also orders like arithmetic books for Angelica when she's very little. So there's evidence that some of that's happening in the home. There are probably tutors. We don't have a lot of, to my knowledge, I haven't seen receipts where we're paying the actual tutors anything, but we sort of assume, and probably it's also a little bit of homeschooling. So, Philip Schuyler certainly has a lot of subjects he's very adept with, including the arithmetic end of things, the geography end of things. And then, of course, they're also, for the girls, they're also learning from their mother how to run a household, how to, and then it's worth mentioning, Catherine Schuyler, their mother, is a very logistics-minded woman, it seems. And so she is running a household, but her reputation is very much as like a very astute, sort of, again, logistics-minded person who is really running the household and thinking on that end of things. Maybe not always the most like maternal figure, but certainly a very
a certain definition of maternal, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a combination of again for the Schuylers in the home, boarding schools, things like that.
And we do have
Johnson's case. I haven't looked in as much detail into her early education as Danielle has for Angelica, but from what I've seen, it's again similar scenario of combination of tutors and a constantly shifting educational opportunity. Basically, what opportunities become available, the family taking advantage of. Also, a lot of prominent families in New York at this time send children down to New York City. Polly's already there. And from those early descriptions of her, we see those themes constantly reiterated of being especially astute when it comes to reading, writing, communicating in general. And that's something that will be a combination of her formal schooling through tutors and other options, but also through the exposure of growing up in these families that are heavily involved in the public sphere. These are families whose entire fortune relies on numbers and communication. It's money and who you know, how you communicate it. They see that from a variety of parental figures at a young age and are growing up immersed in it and emulating that.
And we do have direct receipts for tutors for like painting and dancing and things like that. So apparently Philip Schuyler didn't feel he was competent enough to teach the girls in some of those things.
Yeah, and a lot of those direct receipts that I'm aware of anyway are for the younger daughters. So we have better documentation for what their education is like. And so we can guess that Angelica and the older girls were having similar experiences, but we don't know we don't know how much that was available. Again, there's a 25-year difference between the oldest and youngest daughters, so we're really talking about separate generations, and that the youngest children wouldn't have even remembered the revolution or been born during it yet.
So I think there was another question in front.
So with the advent of AI, do you think that the Library of Congress will use the magic of ChatGPT to roll back some of that redaction so we can see what was really cooking? Or do you think they're just going to be satisfied that it was redacted and leave it alone? That's a grant right in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, my answer is that I don't think that AI is going to be the tool to do that. And in fact, there's actually already folks that are. It has been much more successful to do that kind of work manually. And there are people you're essentially able to remove what is clearly later ink, just like through Photoshop, remove that ink and then try to fill in as best as they can. And there have been some successes in that. I know in particular there's a John Lawrence letter that's been gone over pretty heavily because we think it pretty heavily implies a relationship between Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. or some jealousy at least. When Hamilton gets married, he to Elizabeth, when John finds out, he is not happy. And there's a section of the letter that gets redacted. And there's a couple different guesses as to what it says, but both of them pretty heavily imply that they were playing off of each other's jealousies to make each other mad. Let's put it that way.
So I do want to be conscious of the fact, I think we were originally only scheduled to go until 3. So we are going well beyond our time. We're happy to stay and answer more questions, but just if anyone else was on a schedule, I want to make sure that you're aware, please don't worry about if you have to step out. I know we are beyond time. So I saw another hand here.
Did Lady Johnson and her husband eventually get reunited?
So, yeah, Lady Johnson and John are reunited in New York City. I would love to say that it was a happy reunion and they lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, Sir John Johnson is a fascinating historical figure. There is some wonderful history and fascinating history to relate there. It is not always a happy scenario after. Partially to reiterate Danielle's point about talking about during this conflict, during the revolution, women who are operating within utilizing the expectations the society has put on them to find that space for more agency, more involvement in this public sphere. That is not something that Lady Johnson necessarily finds in later life with her and John. There's a lot of descriptions of marital discord there, and a lot of it seems to stem from her frustrations with how he handles financial matters, with how he handles family dynamics, with his relationship with some of their children, and his frustrations with some of his children not taking an interest in specific topics. She refers to in short, the language that he uses towards those he would profane to love is not becoming, things of that sort. And underneath it all, there is not only just the frustrations of somebody who does not feel valued in that relationship and is having those issues, but somebody who is also frustrated with a lack of ability to take charge of things that she feels are necessary for the harmony, safety, well-being, and advancement of her family. And I think that has something to do with the fact that we have to bear in mind she grows up as somebody who very much takes charge of situations, but in support of her family, in support of those around her. During her period of captivity, yes, she is advocating for her family, advocating for her children. She's the one calling those shots. She receives communications from Sir John, from other family members, but ultimately, she's the one exerting that agency there. She's making critical decisions, and that may be something that becomes a factor in that relationship moving forward. Hard to really say for sure, but that's kind of the long roundabout way of saying yes, they were reunited down in New York City.
There's one question way in the back, I think. Do you need a mic?
Maybe. I don't know.
I was gonna say, we can repeat the question down here for you too, if you'd like.
So I had a question. Were there references to Lady Johnson's pregnancy in her letters or letters about her at all? Or was there kind of like a euphemism that they might have used? Not obviously she's pregnant, but something like that.
So the question was, are there direct references in Lady Johnson's correspondence, referring to her pregnancies, we were saying specifically in her letters, or if there were other euphemisms expressed there? They talk fairly openly and directly about her pregnancies in a lot of cases. The examples that are popping into my brain right off the top of my head, but after the talk, we could always check back for some of the references if you'd like to explore that more. I did bring some of the sources with me. The ones that are popping into my mind right now are mainly in letters from other family members making reference to, at this time, she was delivered of a fine, healthy child, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty direct, open references to that there. And then we can just backdate from the spans when we know the child, when her children are born, to determine the spans that she would have been pregnant during.
I know there are, Philip Schuyler does reference it sometimes in relation to his own family members. He'll be writing to like the governor and be like, oh, Catherine is going to be taking to bed at the end of the month, So like we know, oh, she's due anytime now, things like that. And we actually do have a blog post that I think it just posted on the Schuyler Mansion blog about childbirth and pregnancy at that time. So feel free to check that out as well.
This has nothing to do with this particular story, but I do want to share the best 18th century euphemism that comes from the Schuyler family for pregnancy, which is that at one point, Elizabeth is writing to Angelica, who is now living in Europe, and she says that their sister Peggy came to visit them. She's recently been married to Stephen Van Rensselaer, and she comments on her leaving that she bears no signs of usefulness to the Commonwealth. In other words, she doesn't appear to be pregnant yet.
All right, and I think one last question. There's a young lady there.
Earlier you mentioned that Eliza wanted her papers to be destroyed after she died. Was there a reason that most of them weren't? Was there any reason behind that?
So that wasn't Eliza. That was Abigail Adams. Yep, Abigail Adams. Honestly, John Adams' respect for her. He really believed in the things that she said and that she was writing, and I think she was very self-conscious. She knew that, I think she knew later in her life that the types of things they corresponded about, being heavily political and heavily involved in, she was discussing the Constitution with him, like on an act while it was being created and things like that. And I think that while it was accepted by a lot of people in her life, she also kind of considered them to be like, oh, it's just the ramblings of a girl, and so she was very self-conscious of those letters. And I think it was pretty common for the time period, especially because 18th century folks are very aware of history, and they are aware that they are going to be written about. And because they do it, they were very interested in history. And so because there's kind of this private sphere, public sphere thing that they claim belongs to one person or another, they were very aware that the private matters of our homes, which is what a lot of women are writing about, aren't for public consumption, and we don't want them to be for public consumption. And so even though she is writing about politics, she's very interested in them, she's engaged with them, her husband respected that, she was self-conscious of the fact that she didn't want to be remembered as this figure, and she didn't want to be remembered. So she really wanted that to disappear. And I think he literally writes about it at one point after her death, is that she asked me to burn these, but I can't bring myself to do it. He really loved her, and he really wanted her words to continue to exist.
Well, there's, as you're saying, that idea of a public and private sphere, they're not separating out these conversations and letters between personal matters and other things. And who here wants their entire email correspondence put up on the internet and combed through with a fine-tooth comb, by historians 250 years from now, just because, well, this is a fascinating perspective on a critical time in history. There's some self-consciousness about that for all of us, and especially for folks who are, I would say, in that, in her scenario, in a very elevated position in terms of involvement in those history-shaping events, but also, as you said, facing that social pressure of are her perspectives, is her involvement going to be accepted by following generations as well? So.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note in terms of what Elizabeth does for her redaction, is that idea of we're talking about politics and our personal lives in all the same letters. You may only be sending one letter a week, and you're going to get as much information into it as you can. And so there are clearly letters that Elizabeth just decided to destroy. And then there are these other ones that are like heavily redacted. And it's because there was other important stuff that she did want to be part of her family's legacy in those letters. And then she has to go through and decide. I say she, but keep in mind, her son, John Church Hamilton, also had a hand in this. And we don't know what's done by who. But that they were really deciding that, like, yeah, I don't want this. I don't want to air my dirty laundry out there, but I also really think that other parts of this letter are really important and they need to go down in history as part of his story.
If I could just add one other thing to that. We're talking about the women of the Revolution being involved in these really exciting, important, impactful things. We also have to remember that the Revolution is a conflict. Conflicts are messy, conflicts are bloody, and conflicts have aspects to them that people do not want to talk about or recognize might not reflect well on their cause. Abigail Adams, specifically in this case, there's points where she writes basically saying, I fear that the men who are interrogating suspected loyalist women are being too gentle. Let me at them. There's points where in Hamilton's correspondence between him and Gouverneur Morris, who helps Elizabeth with some of those redactions, they talk about, that the best way to deal with political dissidents and loyalists voicing opposition to the revolution is to have a rash of public hangings. Nothing short of ocular demonstration will convince these incredulous beings that we really do hang them. That's not the words of a revolutionary hero that's going to go down in the history books as leading a glorious cause. These women are involved in atrocities. These women are involved in curating the memory of the men in their lives who are involved in atrocities. And that speaks to their awareness of history and to their education. These are, as you said, these are young women who grow up learning about history in a time period that values history. They are actively shaping it not only in their daily lives, but actively shaping how we remember it and how we talk about it for 250 years and counting.
Yeah, like if Elizabeth could have erased her husband's affair, she probably would have done that. But he went and published it in a newspaper. So, oops.
So I do, because I know we are past time, so I do want to wrap up there and thank everyone for coming. And thank you to Ian and Danielle for presenting.